It was a wine barrel, nothing more. Just old oak and rusted iron buried on a forgotten patch of land. But for 20 years, it wasn't aging wine. It was holding a secret. It held a wedding dress. And in doing so, it held the answer to a question that had utterly destroyed a man's life. For 2 decades, the world believed Liam Donovan was, at best, the fiancé left at the altar, and at worst, a killer who got away with it. He lost his bride, his future, and his name, all in a single night. But the truth wasn't a runaway bride story, and it wasn't about a stranger in the night. The truth was far more venomous. It was hidden in a best friend's smile, and it had been festering in the dark, just waiting for someone to dig. What they were about to pull from that barrel would not only solve a 20-year-old mystery, but it would also expose a betrayal so shocking it would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew about the day the bride vanished. The air in Napa Valley on the evening of October 13, 2001, was a perfect imitation of a dream. It was warm, scented with late-blooming jasmine and the rich, dark soil of the vineyards, at a small, family-owned restaurant, the kind with checkered tablecloths and candles dripping wax onto old wine bottles. The family and friends of Amelia Cartwright and Liam Donovan had gathered for a final celebration before the wedding. The laughter inside was louder than the quiet hum of the countryside, a pocket of pure joy on the verge of a new beginning. Amelia was radiant. Her smile seemed to illuminate everyone it touched. She moved between tables, her hand brushing Liam's shoulder every time she passed, a small, unconscious gesture of connection. Liam, a high school history teacher with a steady gaze and a quiet confidence, couldn't take his eyes off her. To anyone watching, they were the very definition of a perfect match, 2 halves of a single, hopeful story. Later in the evening, after the toasts from their parents had been made, Liam stood up, his wineglass in hand. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, but tonight his voice was clear and full of a profound sense of gratitude. He spoke of Amelia, not just of her beauty or his love for her, but of her spirit. He told the room a story. A few months prior, the town had debated the budget for a small, neglected public park. The funding was cut, the project abandoned. Amelia, a landscape architect by trade, had been dismayed, so she spent the next 3 weekends from dawn until dusk drawing up a complete blueprint for the park's restoration. Beautiful, practical, and efficient. She then presented it to the town council, offering her design for free. Her reasoning, as Liam told it, was simple. Beauty, she had said, shouldn't be a luxury. It should be for everyone. That was Amelia. She didn't just see the world for what it was. She saw it for what it could be, and wasn't afraid to create that beauty with her own hands. As Liam finished his toast, his eyes found hers across the room. In that single look, a lifetime of shared dreams was silently affirmed. Seated next to Amelia, her maid of honor, Chloe Sterling, raised her glass the highest, a beaming smile fixed on her face. Her applause just a little too loud, a little too eager. The next morning, the 14th, dawned crisp and bright. At the Cartwright family home, the atmosphere was electric with a nervous, happy energy. The scent of fresh coffee and hairspray hung in the pot air. Amelia's mother fluttered around her, adjusting the veil, her eyes misty. The wedding dress, a magnificent creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that Amelia had helped design, was hanging in the doorway of her childhood bedroom. It was more than a piece of clothing. It was a promise, a testament to the future that was only hours away. Amelia was a vision of calm amidst the gentle chaos. She sat by the window, already in her gown, making a list of the thank-you notes they would need to write. It was just after 11 in the morning when the phone rang. Her mother answered, then passed the receiver to Amelia. Her side of the conversation was brief, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Oh, right now? Are you sure?" Okay. If it has to be now. But it has to be quick." She hung up and turned to her mother, a slightly exasperated but amused smile on her lips. "That was Chloe," she said, standing up and smoothing the front of her dress. "She says she has a last minute surprise for Liam, Something for the wedding. I have to go get it. Her mother was hesitant. Now, honey? In your dress? Can't she bring it here? No, no, Amelia insisted, already moving toward the door. She says it's better if I pick it up. Don't worry, she's only a few miles away. I'll be back in an hour, tops. Those were the last words her mother would ever hear her speak. She watched from the doorway as Amelia got into her car, the white of the dress a brilliant flash in the California sun, and drove down the long gravel driveway until she disappeared behind a curtain of oak trees. 1 hour passed. The florists arrived. 2 hours passed. The photographers were setting up at the venue. At the Cartwright house, the quiet hum of excitement had been replaced by a low thrum of concern. Amelia's father made the first call. It went straight to voicemail. "Hey, Ames," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Your mom's getting worried. Call us back." Meanwhile, across the valley at the wedding venue, Liam Donovan was a picture of calm. He stood with his groomsmen, adjusting his tie, a relaxed smile on his face. He wasn't worried. Amelia was often a few minutes late, lost in a project, or stopping to admire a garden. He tried her cell at 1:30. It rang, then went to her cheerful recorded greeting. "Hey, it's Amelia. Leave a message, and I'll call you back." He didn't leave one. By 3 o'clock, the guests were scheduled to begin arriving. Liam's smile was gone. He stood on the manicured lawn of the estate, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to that same cheerful greeting over and over again. The words, once so full of life, now sounded like a mocking echo from a world that was quickly slipping out of focus. He called her parents. Panic was now tightening their voices. No, they hadn't heard from her. They'd already called Chloe, who said Amelia never showed up. This is where the timeline begins to blur, where a day of celebration curdles into a nightmare. For Liam, those next few hours were a descent into a specific kind of hell. The logical part of his brain, the history teacher who dealt in facts and evidence, tried to rationalize. Her car broke down. Her phone died. There was a simple, logical explanation, but a colder, more primal part of him knew better. He walked away from the gathering crowd, away from the questioning looks and the hushed whispers, and dialed her number for the 10th, then the 20th time. Each time, the sound of her voice on the recording felt like a physical blow. He started leaving messages, his voice cracking, the thin veneer of calm shattering into a million pieces. "Amelia, please call me. Just let me know you're okay. This isn't funny anymore." "Ames? Where are you? I'm getting scared. Everyone's here. I'm here, waiting." The sun began to dip below the Mayacamas Mountains, casting long, ominous shadows across the pristine wedding grounds. The string quartet, hired to play Vivaldi as guests arrived, stood in awkward silence. The caterers stopped uncorking champagne. A single, defining moment of clarity cut through Liam's frantic haze. It came as he dialed her number one last time. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she wouldn't answer. He knew she wasn't just late. This wasn't a case of cold feet. This wasn't a prank. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The beautiful future he had toasted to just the night before, the world he had built around Amelia, had not just been put on hold. It had been fractured. And standing there, with his bride's recorded voice echoing in his ear, Liam Donovan felt the first terrifying tremor of a world that had just collapsed beneath his feet. The long wait, the endless desert of uncertainty, was just beginning. The first police officers on the scene treated Liam Donovan with a gentle, practiced sympathy. They saw a young man in shock, a groom whose world had just been stolen. From him hours before, he could officially claim it. But as the sun set and the last of the wedding guests were sent home, as the pristine white chairs sat empty on the lawn, the tone began to shift. The questions became less gentle, more pointed. Where was he that morning? Who was the last person to speak with her? Did they argue? In the sterile light of an interrogation room, the sympathy vanished entirely. Liam sat in his wedding suit, the fabric feeling like a costume from another man's. Life, as detectives circled him, his grief, raw and chaotic, was viewed through a lens of professional suspicion. His confusion was interpreted as calculation. His pleas for them to find Amelia were heard as the desperate deflections of a guilty man. He recounted the morning, the phone call, the story Chloe had told Amelia's parents. The detectives exchanged a look, a last-minute surprise, a secret meeting. It was a narrative that sounded flimsy, a story custom-made to create an opportunity. His home was searched. His computer, his journals, his letters, all the private artifacts of his life with Amelia were bagged and tagged as evidence. He was subjected to a polygraph, the cold sensors on his skin feeling like an accusation. He passed, but the lead detective dismissed it. "A polygraph just tells us if you're nervous," he said, his voice flat. "And a man whose fiancée just disappeared has every reason to be." In the eyes of the law, Liam Donovan was not the primary victim of a tragedy. He was the primary suspect in a crime. In this suffocating fog of suspicion, Chloe Sterling emerged as his only anchor. She was a whirlwind of frantic efficiency. She was the one who found him a lawyer. She was the one who spoke to the press, her voice trembling with perfectly pitched sorrow as she defended Liam's character. She would show up at his door at all hours, carrying containers of food he never ate, her eyes full of a fierce protective loyalty. "They're fools, Liam," she would say, sitting across from him in the suffocating silence of his living room. "They're not looking for Amelia anymore. They're just looking for someone to blame." To Liam, her presence was the only thing that felt real. He clung to her friendship, to her unwavering belief in his innocence. He didn't see the subtle poison in her words, how she consistently isolated him from others, framing the world as a hostile force that only she could navigate on his behalf. To the outside world, however, her devotion looked different. Whispers started to circulate. Perhaps they were in it together. Perhaps Chloe's loyalty was not that of a friend, but of an accomplice. Her every act of support only served to tighten the net of suspicion around him. The shadow of that suspicion was long, and it crept into every corner of his life. Liam had been a beloved history teacher, known for making the past feel alive. Now he was a pariah. Parents wrote letters to the school board. Students stared at him. In the hallways, their adolescent curiosity mixed with fear. He was placed on a leave of absence, a gentle term for an exile. The leave became permanent. The career he had built, the identity that had defined him, was another casualty of Amelia's disappearance. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The official investigation slowed to a crawl. The media, once camped on his lawn, packed up their vans and moved on to the next tragedy. The world began to forget Amelia Cartwright, but Liam could not. His quiet, orderly home began to transform. The living room, where he and Amelia had once planned their future, became an incident room. He pinned a large map of Napa Valley to the wall, marking Amelia's last known location. He created timelines, cross-referencing phone records he'd had to fight to get, noting every inconsistency, every unanswered question. He spent his nights online, scrolling through forums for families of missing persons, searching for a clue, a pattern, anything the police might have missed. He had lost his career, his friends, his future. This investigation was the only thing he had left, and things had been missed. In the third week of the investigation, an elderly neighbor of the Cartwrights had told a patrol officer about a car he'd seen that morning, a dark green sedan, he thought, driving away from the direction of the Cartwrights' home at an unusual speed. He mentioned it because it seemed to be the same model as the one Amelia's friend Chloe drove. But he was old, his eyesight wasn't perfect, and he couldn't be sure of the exact time. The tip was logged, filed away in a mountain of paperwork by detectives who were already convinced their prime suspect was the groom. The lead was never pursued. The truth had surfaced for a brief moment, only to be buried again under the weight of assumption. Years fell away, each one carving deeper lines into Liam's face. The world moved on, but he remained frozen in 2001, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The passage of time was marked only by the agonizing anniversaries of the day she was taken from him. October 14th, 2011, 10 years. On that evening, Liam sat alone in his silent house. He pulled a dusty box from the top of his closet. Inside lay the artifacts of a wedding that never happened. 2 simple gold bands, a small velvet box holding the pearl earrings he was going to give her, and a piece of paper, folded and worn from years of being handled, on which he had written his vows. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The words he had written as a hopeful young man now read like a eulogy. He spoke them aloud to the empty room, his voice hoarse with a grief that was as fresh and raw as it had been a decade before. It was a promise of a lifetime of love, of growing old together, of facing any challenge as long as they were a team. But he had been alone for every challenge. He had faced the accusations alone, he had lost his life alone, and he had searched for her alone. There in the quiet dark, the full weight of the last 10 years pressed down on him. It was a decade spent in a desolate wasteland of not knowing, a long desert of uncertainty, where hope was a cruel mirage. He carefully folded the vows and placed them back in the box. He didn't know then that the truth was waiting, preserved and silent, sealed in a tomb of oak and iron, biding its time. For Liam there was only the long, empty night and the promise of another year and another after. That of the same haunting silence. For 20 years, the story of Amelia Cartwright lay dormant, buried not just in the earth, but under the heavy dust of time and forgotten files. Liam Donovan's life had settled into a quiet, rigid routine, a fortress of solitude he had built to survive the unending silence. The world had, for all intents and purposes, moved on. And then, in the summer of 2021, a young couple with a dream bought a piece of that world and accidentally unearthed a nightmare. The property was known as Blackwood Vineyard, a once proud estate that had fallen into neglect. Its vines were tangled, its buildings weathered. But Sarah and Tom Miller saw potential. They poured their life savings into the land, envisioning a boutique winery, a place of new beginnings. The work was hard. It meant clearing decades of debris, taming the overgrown landscape, and preparing the soil for new vines. On a hot Tuesday in August, Tom was operating a small backhoe, clearing a thicket of brush in a far corner of the property that hadn't been touched in generations. The machine's engine groaned as it tore through roots and earth until it was stopped by a sudden, jarring thud. The impact sent a vibration through the machine. Tom cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of his own curiosity. He jumped down from the cab and walked over to the freshly turned soil. Sticking out of the ground was the curved, rusted iron edge of something large and round. He grabbed a shovel, and after a few minutes of digging, the object's full form was revealed. It was a heavy oak wine barrel, its wood stained dark by the damp earth. It was old, clearly not part of the vineyard's recent operations. For a moment he and Sarah were excited. Perhaps they'd found a Prohibition-era relic, a hidden stash of century-old wine. Getting it out of the ground was a struggle. It was heavier than it should have been, unnaturally so. With a final heave, they rolled it onto the flat ground. The lid was sealed shut, swollen with age and moisture. It took a crowbar and their combined weight to finally pry it open. The seal broke with a sigh of stale, musty air. They peered inside. There was no wine. There were no bottles. There was only a shocking, impossible splash of white. A mass of fabric, pristine and ghostly against the dark, rotted interior of the barrel. Sarah reached in slowly, her hand trembling, and touched it. It was silk. She pulled at a section, and as more of it was revealed, the shape became unmistakable. Lace, a bodice, a sleeve. It was a wedding dress. Sarah stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth as a wave of nausea and understanding washed over her. This wasn't a relic. This wasn't a prank. This was a tomb. The sight of that beautiful, lonely dress, packed away in the dark, felt like a silent scream. Tom Miller's call to 911 was breathless, his voice struggling to explain the inexplicable thing they had just found on their land. The call from the Napa County Sheriff's Department landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was in her early 30s, a sharp, tenacious investigator who had recently joined the department's newly refunded cold case unit. She had a passion for forgotten stories, for the victims whose files were gathering dust in the archives. When the name Amelia Cartwright was flagged by the dispatcher, it sent a jolt of recognition through her. It was one of the county's most infamous unsolved cases, a local myth of love and loss. But now it was no longer a myth. It was an active crime scene. 2 days later, the phone rang in the quiet, sterile environment of the county archives, where Liam Donovan now worked. He spent his days surrounded by the neatly ordered histories of other people, a job that suited the man he had become. Meticulous, silent, and emotionally detached. He rarely answered his phone, but the caller ID said, Napa Sheriff's Department. A cold dread, a feeling he hadn't experienced with such intensity in years, seized him. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and unfamiliar. Mr. Donovan, my name is Detective Rossi. I'm with the cold case unit. I'm calling you regarding the disappearance of Amelia Cartwright. Time seemed to warp. Liam was suddenly 28 again, standing in that interrogation room, the weight of accusation pressing down on him. His throat was dry. Yes, he managed to say. Mr. Donovan, the detective continued, her voice even. I'm calling to inform you that we have had a new development in the case, a significant one. We have found something we believe belonged to Amelia. Liam sank into his chair, the historical documents around him fading into a meaningless blur. The fortress he had built around his heart was crumbling. For 20 years, he had prayed for a breakthrough, for a sign, for anything that would break the silence. Now that it was here, it was terrifying. Hope, he realized, was a dangerous, double-edged thing. It brought with it the promise of answers, but also the certainty of reliving the agony. He left the station that day in a daze. He didn't know what the dress would tell the investigators. He didn't know if it would lead to an arrest or simply create more agonizing questions. But as he walked out into the sunlight, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. An echo had finally returned from the void, and it was about to become a roar. The narrator would later explain the science that Liam was only just beginning to grasp. In 2001, DNA testing was still in its relative infancy. A single degraded strand of hair was often useless. But in 2021, the technology was exponentially more advanced. Forensic specialists could now extract a full genetic profile from the tiniest root of a hair. They could analyze microscopic particles of soil, pollen, and fibers, tracing them back to specific locations with astonishing accuracy. Every speck of dust on that dress was a potential witness, every fiber a potential lead. Liam listened, his mind reeling. He had spent 2 decades trapped in a story with no ending. The police had had nothing, no body, no weapon, no crime scene. All they'd had was a missing woman and a fiancé with no alibi. But the discovery of the dress had changed the entire equation. It was the crime scene, a perfectly preserved 20-year-old crime scene, delivered to them by a stroke of pure chance. He left the station that day in a daze. He didn't know what the dress would tell the investigators. He didn't know if it would lead to an arrest or simply create more agonizing questions. But as he walked out into the sunlight, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The long, silent desert he had wandered for half his life was over. An echo had finally returned from the void, and it was about to become a roar. While Liam Donovan waited in a self-imposed purgatory, the dress began to speak. In the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the Napa County Forensics Lab, Amelia Cartwright's wedding gown was treated not as a sacred relic, but as a silent witness that was finally ready to testify. Under the harsh, unforgiving light of examination tables, forensic scientists began a painstaking process of persuasion. Every inch of the silk was photographed. Every fold of the lace was gently vacuumed, its microscopic contents captured in sealed filters. Under alternate light sources, the fabric glowed, revealing faint, traces and stains invisible to the naked eye. For 20 years, the dress had held its secrets. Now it was being asked to give them up. Detective Rossi's new investigation was a stark contrast to the original. The first team had been looking for a man. Rossi, unburdened by the tunnel vision of the past, was simply looking for the truth, and she knew the truth was in the details. She pursued the science with a relentless patience, knowing that a single fiber, a grain of pollen, could blow the ice case wide open. After weeks of meticulous analysis, the first report from the lab landed on her desk. It contained 3 critical findings that would change everything. The first was a confirmation. DNA scraped from the inside of the bodice was a perfect match to Amelia Cartwright. It was a procedural but vital fact, officially tying the victim to the barrel and proving, beyond any doubt, that she had been wearing the dress when she was buried in it. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide investigation. The second finding was the anomaly. Caught in the delicate lacework of a sleeve was a single strand of hair. It was long, and under the microscope, it showed the distinct, uniform coloration of artificial dye, a coppery red. It did not belong to Amelia. In 2001, a single hair without a root might have been a dead end. But forensic science had evolved. Technicians were able to isolate the hair's mitochondrial DNA, confirming it belonged to an unknown female. White Bar was the first piece of concrete, physical evidence in 2 decades that pointed to a third person being with Amelia. It was the ghost in the machine, the first crack in the official narrative that had stood for 20 years. The third finding was the impossible clue. The vacuum filters that had cleaned the dress's hem were filled with microscopic particles. Among the soil and common dust, botanists identified trace amounts of a specific, highly unusual pollen. It belonged to the bea, more commonly known as the gold of Kinabalu orchid. The narrator would explain that this was not just any flower. It is famously one of the rarest and most expensive orchids in the world, notoriously difficult to cultivate, and native only to the slopes of Mount Kinabalu in Borneo. Its pollen grains are heavy and sticky. They don't travel on the wind. For this pollen to be on the hem of Amelia's dress, she would have had to brush directly against a blooming plant. The lab's botanical database confirmed that there were no registered commercial growers of this species in Northern California. It was the exclusive domain of a handful of elite private collectors. The killer hadn't just left a clue, they had left a signature as unique and traceable as a fingerprint. Detective Rossi now had what 2 decades of police work had failed to produce, a new direction. She called Liam Donovan and asked him to come back to the station. Liam entered the same small, bare-walled room as before, his posture guarded, his expression a mask of weary resignation. He had learned the hard way that hope was a precursor to disappointment. Rossi, however, was direct. She didn't offer sympathy, she offered facts. She walked him through the report. And with each finding, a new crack appeared in the wall Liam had built around himself. She told him about the confirmation of Amelia's DNA. Liam nodded slowly, the grim finality of her death settling upon him like a physical weight. Then she told him about the hair. "We found a single strand of reddish-brown hair on the dress," Rossi said, watching him carefully. "It's not Amelia's. The DNA profile belongs to another woman." For a moment, Liam didn't react. He simply stared at the detective, processing her words. Then an emotion he hadn't felt in 20 years washed over him. Vindication. A profound, aching relief that was so intense it felt like pain. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "I told them," he said, looking past Rossi, as if speaking to the ghosts of the original detectives. "I told them she wasn't alone. I told them to look for someone else." For 2 decades, his intuition had been dismissed as the ramblings of a grieving, guilty man. Now here was the proof, scientific and irrefutable. He wasn't crazy. He had been right. But it was the third clue that would shatter his world all over again. Rossi pushed a photograph across the table. It showed a strange, beautiful, alien-looking flower, its striped petals reaching out like arms. "This is the orchid, Mr. Donovan." Our botanists say it's exceptionally rare. Does it mean anything to you? Liam stared at the photograph, and a dormant memory flickered in the dark recesses of his mind. It was a faint image at first, a memory he hadn't accessed in over 20 years. A warm, humid afternoon, the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. He was younger, happy, standing beside Amelia in a large glass greenhouse. Chloe was there, and so was her mother, a proud, keen horticulturalist. Mrs. Sterling was showing them her prized collection, and she led them to one plant in particular, her masterpiece, she had called it. It was that flower, that strange, striped, magnificent orchid. Liam remembered Amelia touching one of its petals gently, marveling at its alien beauty. The memory solidified, rushing back with perfect, horrifying clarity. He looked up from the photograph, his face pale. The blood had drained from it. The sense of vindication he had felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a dizzying, nauseating horror. Chloe, her mother's greenhouse, the one person who had been his staunchest defender, the one person who had held his hand through the darkest days of his life. He didn't share the memory with Rossi. He couldn't. The implication was too monstrous to speak aloud. To accept that Chloe could be involved was to accept that his entire reality for the past 20 years, his grief, his isolation, his unwavering trust in her, friendship, had been built on a foundation of the most profound and cruel deception imaginable. Liam left the police station a different man. The burden he carried was no longer the simple, heavy weight of grief and suspicion. It was now a new, more complex agony. The search for Amelia's killer was no longer a quest for a faceless stranger who had shattered his life. It was now a terrifying, internal battle pitting 2 decades of trust against one impossible, horrifying memory. The ghost of the past had returned, and it was beginning to take the shape of his closest friend. The days that followed Liam's meeting with Detective Rossi were a special kind of torment. He existed in a state of suspended animation, paralyzed by the horrific possibility that had taken root in his mind. Sleep offered no escape. He'd find himself staring at old photographs, searching the smiling face of Chloe Sterling for a flicker of the monster he now feared was there. He saw her standing next to Amelia, arm in arm, both of them beaming in the summer sun. He saw the 3 of them together, laughing on a boat, the picture of perfect friendship. There was no sign, no warning, no hint of the darkness that festered beneath the surface. He was torn by a profound and dizzying conflict. To speak his suspicion aloud felt like a betrayal of the young woman who had been his only ally. It felt like a betrayal of Amelia's memory of her best friend. What if he was wrong? What if the orchid was a coincidence, a red herring that would only inflict more pain? But what if he was right? What if his silence allowed a killer to remain free, wrapped in a life of suburban comfort she had stolen? After 3 sleepless nights, the second question became the only one that mattered. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for Detective Rossi. He didn't offer a theory or an accusation. He simply offered a fact, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if he were reading an entry from one of his archives. "The orchid," he said. "From the photograph, I remember it. Chloe Sterling's mother had a greenhouse at her home. She grew them. Amelia and I saw them there a few months before the wedding." He said nothing more and hung up, the weight of the betrayal now shared, for better or for worse. Rossi and her team began to build their case with quiet, methodical precision. They delved into the archives of 2001. They pulled yearbooks, social pages from the local paper, and photo albums from other members of the wedding party. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for. In picture after picture from that era, Chloe Sterling stared back, her hair a cascade of the exact coppery red described in the forensic report. The face of the unknown woman from the dress was now looking right at them. The next step was delicate. Rossi needed to interview Chloe, but she needed to do it without revealing the evidence she held. She arranged a meeting at Chloe's home under the pretense of a final follow-up, a simple matter of dotting the I's and crossing the T's on a cold case. Chloe's life, it appeared, was perfect. She lived in an immaculate modern home with floor-to-ceiling windows and a manicured garden. She was a successful real estate agent, a wife, and a mother. She greeted Rossi with a polished, confident smile, offering her coffee, the picture of a cooperative citizen. She was poised, articulate, and exuded an air of practiced sympathy as she spoke of the unthinkable tragedy of Amelia's disappearance. Rossi let her talk, guiding the conversation gently back to the days before the wedding. She asked about the mood, the plans, the relationships. Chloe spoke of her friendship with Amelia in glowing terms, painting herself as the devoted, heartbroken best friend. Then Rossi set the trap. Amelia's parents mentioned she left the house that morning to pick up a surprise from you, Rossi said, her tone casual. Do you have any idea what that might have been about? Chloe leaned forward, her expression thoughtful, as if she were trying hard to remember. It was a flawless performance of someone searching their memory for a helpful clue. Oh, that, she said with a sad little smile. It was a gift. I had bought these beautiful antique silver lockets for all the bridesmaids, engraved with their initials. Amelia was so excited about them. She was supposed to come get them for me that day to give out at the wedding dinner. It was a brilliant lie. It was detailed, emotional, and plausible. But it was a lie. Rossi knew from her interviews with the other bridesmaids that they had received their lockets a full week earlier at the bridal shower. The detail was a fabrication, a tiny self-important insertion into a timeline where she didn't belong. In her attempt to seem central to Amelia's final hours, Chloe had inadvertently revealed that she was hiding something. A truthful person would have simply said, I have no idea what she was talking about. A liar, desperate to control the narrative, invents a story. Rossi left the meeting with a calm, professional thank you, leaving Chloe believing she had successfully navigated a tiresome formality. But Rossi now had everything she needed. Liam's testimony about the orchid placed Amelia in proximity to the unique pollen. The photographs proved Chloe had the red hair, and her lie about the lockets provided the critical evidence of deceptive behavior. She had probable cause. That afternoon, she obtained 2 warrants. The first was for a DNA sample from Chloe Sterling, which they could legally obtain from the coffee cup she had just used. The second was for access to the greenhouse at her mother's former residence, which Chloe now maintained after her mother had moved into assisted living. The breakthrough, when it came, was absolute. The forensic team entered the humid, fragrant world of the greenhouse. In the corner, just as Liam had remembered, was a collection of rare orchids, including several blooming. The pollen samples taken from the plants were rushed to the lab. The results came back 48 hours later. It was a trifecta of irrefutable scientific certainty. The pollen from the greenhouse was a perfect match to the pollen found on the hem of Amelia's wedding dress. The DNA from Chloe's coffee cup was a perfect match to the DNA from the single red hair that had been clinging to the lace for 20 years. The chase was over. Detective Rossi sat at her desk and laid out 3 items in a row: the lab report on the pollen, the photo of Chloe with red hair from 2001, and the transcript of her lie about the silver lockets. The shadow that had haunted Liam Donovan for 2 decades now had a name, a face, and a forensic signature. The evil that had hidden in plain sight for so long was about to be dragged into the light. The arrest of Chloe Sterling did not happen in the dead of night. It happened in the bright fluorescent glare of her successful life. Detective Rossi and 2 other plainclothes officers walked into the sleek, glass-walled real estate agency Chloe managed. Clients were looking at brochures, phones were ringing. Chloe was in the middle of a call, smiling, closing a deal. When she saw the detectives approaching, her smile faltered for only a fraction of a second before her professional mask snapped back into place. She met them in her office, coolly asking how she could help. There were no sirens, no drawn weapons. Rossi simply said her name and told her she was under arrest for the murder of Amelia Cartwright. The color drained from Chloe's face. The entire office fell silent, the scene playing out like a slow-motion film. The woman who had built a life on a foundation of lies was being dismantled in front of the very world she had worked so hard to impress. In the interrogation room, the same sterile box where Liam's life had been rerouted 2 decades earlier, Chloe's composure returned, but this time it was brittle, laced with arrogance and indignation. She scoffed, threatened to sue every person in the department, and called the accusation absurd. She was the grieving best friend. She was a respected member of the community. This was a mistake. Detective Rossi did not argue. She simply sat down opposite Chloe and placed a file on the table between them. "Let's talk about the wedding dress, Chloe," she began, her voice calm and even. She laid out the first photograph, the single copper-red hair magnified 1,000 times. "We found a hair on the sleeve. Forensic testing has advanced quite a bit since 2001. We were able to get a full DNA profile from it. It belongs to you." Chloe laughed, a sharp, unconvincing sound. "That's ridiculous. I probably hugged her at the rehearsal. A hair could have gotten on her clothes at any time." Rossi slid a second photograph across the table. The strange, alien-like orchid. "Then let's talk about this. We found its pollen on the hem of the dress, the specific, rare pollen from the orchids in your mother's greenhouse." Chloe's posture tightened. The first genuine crack appeared in her facade. "Amelia loved my mother's greenhouse. She visited it all the time. That proves nothing." "But she didn't visit it all the time, did she, Chloe?" Rossi countered, her voice still level. "She visited it once with Liam, and she visited it one last time on the morning of her wedding, the morning she disappeared." Rossi then pushed the final piece of paper across the table, the transcript of Chloe's lie. "And then there are the lockets, the bridesmaid gifts you claimed Amelia was coming to pick up, the gifts every other bridesmaid confirms you had already given them the week before. Why would you lie about that, Chloe?" Chloe stared at the transcript. There was nowhere left to run. The science, the lies, the facts, they had formed a cage of inescapable truth around her. Her defiant mask crumbled, replaced by a contorted expression of pure, narcissistic rage. The game was over. With her confession and the evidence pieced together from the scene, the full, horrifying story of Amelia Cartwright's final hours could finally be told. Chloe's envy had been a slow-burning fire for years. She had coveted Amelia's life, her talent, and most of all, her relationship with Liam, a man Chloe had been secretly obsessed with since college. When the engagement was announced, her envy curdled into a desperate, delusional obsession. On the morning of the wedding, she made the call. She invented a crisis, a surprise for Liam, knowing Amelia's loyalty and kindness were her greatest weaknesses. She lured her to the one place they could be completely alone, the humid, isolated greenhouse. There, amidst the beautiful exotic flowers, Chloe made her last desperate plea, begging Amelia to call off the wedding, telling her she was making a mistake, that Liam didn't truly love her. Amelia, naturally, was horrified and stunned. She rejected Chloe, telling her she was being absurd, that she needed help. And it was that rejection, that dismissal, that caused Chloe's narcissistic ego to shatter. In a fit of violent rage, she shoved Amelia. It was a single, petulant, violent act, but it was fatal. Amelia stumbled backward, her head striking the sharp stone edge of a large planter. She fell to the ground and never got up. What followed was not panic, but a chilling, cold-blooded efficiency. Chloe knew what she had to do. She wrapped Amelia's body and dragged it to her car. She drove to the abandoned Blackwood vineyard, a place she knew from her childhood, a place no one would think to look. There, under the cover of the overgrown landscape, she committed her final, most symbolic act of desecration. She opened the barrel and forced Amelia, limp and lifeless inside, still clad in her beautiful wedding gown. She buried the bride. She buried the wedding. She buried the future she couldn't have. Then she sealed the tomb and went on with her life. Detective Rossi delivered the news to Liam in person. She found him at the archives, in his quiet sanctuary of ordered history. She told him they had made an arrest and that Chloe Sterling had confessed. Liam had imagined this moment for 20 years. In his fantasies, it was a wave of triumphant relief, a surge of righteous justice. The reality was a sickening, physical blow. It was the feeling of the floor dropping out from under him for the second time in his life. The room seemed to tilt, the air growing thin. It wasn't just that Chloe had killed Amelia. It was that she had stayed. She had attended the memorials. She had brought him food. She had hugged him while he cried. She had watched him suffer day after day, year after year, and her performance of friendship had never wavered. His pain had not just been a consequence of her crime. It had been the second act of it. The face of evil wasn't that of a monster lurking in the shadows. It was the familiar smiling face of a friend, a face that had lied to him with every breath for 2 decades. The truth hadn't set him free. It had simply revealed the true, horrifying depth of the prison he'd been in all along. Chloe Sterling's trial was a formality, a final public chapter, in a story whose brutal conclusion had already been written. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. Her confession, though later recanted in a desperate last-ditch effort by her defense team, was damning. Throughout the proceedings, she showed no remorse. She sat cold and impassive, a marble statue of indignation. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, and the sentence handed down, life in prison without the possibility of parole, she simply stared ahead, her expression empty. The mask of the friendly, supportive friend had been replaced by the chilling void of a true narcissist, incapable of seeing a world beyond her own thwarted desires. For the community, justice had been served. For the families, a legal conclusion had been reached. But for Liam Donovan, the end of the trial was not the end of the story. The world now looked at him differently. The whispers of suspicion were replaced by outspoken waves of sympathy. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now approached him with sad eyes and awkward, mumbled apologies. He was no longer the pariah. He was now the tragic hero, the long-suffering victim. But to Liam, it was just another label, another identity forged by Chloe's crime. There was relief, of course, a quiet, profound relief in his public exoneration, in knowing that the truth was finally known. But there was no joy. There was no sense of victory. The end of the 20-year war had only left him standing alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of a life that could never be rebuilt. The knowledge of what happened didn't erase the 2 decades he had lost, or the consuming bitterness of Chloe's profound betrayal. Closure, he discovered, was not a destination you arrived at. It was simply the quiet, desolate landscape you were left with after the fighting was over. For months, he drifted. The question that had driven him for half his life, what happened to Amelia, had been answered. And in its absence, there was only a vast, silent emptiness. He had forgotten how to live a life that wasn't defined by that single, obsessive search. One autumn afternoon, he found himself driving, almost unconsciously, to the small public park whose design Amelia had gifted to the town all those years ago. It was thriving. The trees she had chosen were now tall and full, their leaves a brilliant tapestry of red and gold. Children were laughing on the playground, and couples walked hand in hand along the paths she had laid out. He sat on a bench, watching this vibrant scene of everyday life. And for the first time, he felt a different kind of peace settle over him. This park, this small pocket of beauty for everyone, was her true legacy. It was a living, breathing testament not to how she had died, but to the brilliant, generous, and hopeful way she had lived. And in that moment, Liam realized that his purpose was not to drown in the past, but to find a way to honor the spirit she had left behind. He found that purpose in the pain. Drawing from his own inheritance and the quiet, solitary life he had lived, Liam established a new foundation. He called it the Amelia Cartwright Project. Its mission was simple but vital: to provide resources, support, and private funding for families caught in the agonizing limbo of cold cases. It was a way to help others navigate the same dark, lonely desert he had wandered for 20 years. It was a way to ensure that other victims were not forgotten, that their stories continued to be told, and that their families did not have to search for answers alone. It was his way of creating beauty from ashes. The story of Amelia Cartwright is a brutal lesson in the darkness of human envy and the devastating power of a secret. But it is also a story of a truth that refused to stay buried, a testament to the quiet perseverance of a new generation of investigators and the enduring power of love that outlasts even the most profound betrayal. Amelia's voice, silenced in a violent, jealous rage, was finally heard after 20 years of silence. Amelia's story is a powerful reminder that behind every cold case is a human being whose memory deserves to be honored. The fight for truth, no matter how long it takes, is a testament to the love that endures. Our mission is to ensure these stories are never forgotten. If you want to be a part of that mission,